actually remember which episode this is, and that is because I wasn't actually planning to do this episode. Well, I was planning to do it, but it's very short notice, last minute plan. So here we are. But the reason is because tomorrow is Halloween. And I thought, what better time to chat about witchcraft and medicine and the connection between the two than today. So here we are. It's the day before Halloween. I'm also very excited about that, like unreasonably excited. This year is the most, I'm saying this wrong. I have never been as invested in Halloween before as I have been this year. I have been crafting and making decoration. I have never before this year decorated the inside of my house for Halloween. Let's just say that. And let's not just say that because I'm so excited. My mantelpiece is completely decorated over the fireplace. There's black lace and skulls and witchy stuff and all kinds of good. I'm out of control is what I'm trying to tell you. I even spent a good solid hour or possibly more outside with the neighbor's kid this afternoon, decorating our front yard together. Cobwebs, skeletons, dead brides floating in the trees. We've got it all. And in fact, I can see it from where I'm sitting through the window. I wish you could see it too, but you can't. You can just see me. Unless you're listening. If this is audio, then you're just listening and you can see whatever you want. I'll post pictures on Instagram and then you can see those. There you go. Problem solved. All right. So anyways, today we're talking about witchcraft and medicine because for quite some time, at least since the 70s, maybe earlier, it's kind of been not common knowledge, but it's just been understood that during the witch hunts and witch trials, that a lot of the women who were accused and tried and convicted, sentenced, and even burned at the stake were midwives and healers and herbalists and wise women, as they were called. And you'll see it in lots of movies and in documentaries and even on TV shows. There's what's the show that's going on right now? Outlander, for example. One of the main characters she's a nurse or a doctor, and she's gone back in time. Spoiler alert, sorry. And so she has all this knowledge, and she's arguing with a priest at one point in the show about the treatment of someone who's been poisoned, but he thinks that they've been possessed. And of course, so then she's tried as a witch because what is this nonsense? Anyways, I just totally derailed. I did not mean to talk about that, but there you go. So you'll see lots of this in mainstream TV, movie stuff. And that's because we know that many of the witches who were, or I shouldn't say the witches, the women who were accused were midwives and healers and herbalists and what have you. However, there's been a lot of pushback now from historians and academics and other people who have done extensive research into this, who feel that, or no, who claim that we don't actually have real hard evidence of this being true, that they were specifically targeted. So let me go back a little bit to the 70s when two women who were right in the midst of the feminist movement put out a pamphlet called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, in which they basically said that women who were healers, practitioners, midwives, etc., were persecuted specifically so that men could take over those jobs. And the thing is, that did happen in a way, in a big way, but there are people that have, pointed out the fact that, first of all, the witch trials were earlier than when men basically took over most of the medical system for a very long time. And they also pointed out that we don't have a lot of documented evidence other than what was written down during the trials, or also confessions that were made by these so-called witches. So in the pamphlet, which is Midwives and Nurses, biologist Barbara Ehrenreich, if I'm saying her name correctly, I hope so, and sociologist Deirdre English wrote, "The witch is accused not only of murdering, poisoning, sex crimes, and conspiracy, but of helping and healing." And the thing is, that lack of evidence is what is sort of fueling the debate, I guess, against that. But at the same time, we don't actually know. Like, let me just say that it's more about our perspective or about our interpretation of the documentation that does exist, because there is documentation that exists in that, as I said, they did document the trials. But the people who were documenting it obviously had a very biased opinion, and also were probably covering their tracks in a way. So obviously they're not going to write that she's being tried for being a midwife, because that's not what she's being tried for. She's being tried for being a witch. And in fact, there were some women healers and midwives who were there as, let's say, professional witnesses, who were not being accused, but were examining the women who were being accused of witchcraft. So it's not to say that everybody who was a midwife or an herbalist or a healer was automatically suspected to be a witch. The thing is, we do know that women were often the ones who had knowledge of certain herbs and remedies. They were most often the women who were delivering babies, and they were often the caregivers and people who were nursing people back to health. And there, when newborn babies were being cared for. And we also know that in medieval Europe, 80% of the people who were accused of being witches were women. It's 80, so it's a lot. We also know that women were generally supposed to be passive, silent, submissive, and basically confined to the home. So if you were not all of those things, you were certainly more likely to be suspect. And if you stood up against that, if you stood up for yourself, you're certainly more likely to be accused. And accused not just of being a witch, but of practicing witchcraft or magic for revenge against your oppressors, basically. And then naturally also performing sacrifices and killing and eating babies and children, obviously. Some of the latter accusations were definitely more directed towards midwives and people who were assisting childbirth, because if a baby should be stillborn or unwell and die shortly after birth, often the midwife would then be accused of having hexed the family or cursed the baby or performed some sort of herbal magic before the birth. And then, of course, at some point, witches went from being, I shouldn't say of course, but naturally, no. Women, at first, the witches were seen as being a potential threat to people, but then suddenly they were also threatening Christianity as a whole and the church. And this is where people felt safe and had their sense of security and community from. So this was, extremely scary. And then this is where witches also went, not just from, casting spells or cursing people a la carte, but but also of just trying to take the whole system of religion down. And somehow, because they were so morally weak and sexually charged and unable to resist the seduction of the devil, so powerful enough to do all this harm, but not powerful enough to resist the allure of Satan himself. So of course they not only worshipped him, but also had sex with him. And I'm not sure why. I should look that up. I'm not sure where this preoccupation came from, but we are talking about organized religion here, so I probably don't need to go too deep into that. So famed witch hunters Kramer and Springer, I think his name is, said no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives. So we do know that it was not entirely unfounded, the claims that midwives and healers were targeted. And of course, there were other situations as well. But even those inside the church were not entirely immune to these accusations, because there was a movie actually based on this, but there was a 60-year-old nun, Costanza della Biano. She was practicing midwifery and healing in Tuscany, Italy, and she was accused of being a witch because this was in 1594, because villagers had accused her of causing the death of several babies. And she administered ointments to some of these to the women, during their pregnancy. And she, admitted this, but said that, these are basically normally used remedies or ointments, and that she did this with no intention of actually harming any children. And she was then sentenced to torture on the ropes. And during this torture, she confessed to, so she was hung by the arms on these ropes, and she was tortured while they tried to force a confession out of her. And then so finally she did confess to practicing witchcraft on several of her patients, and she talked about relationships with demons and sucking children's blood. And she said that this all started after a devil had come to her, and then later admitted that she'd made all of that up in hopes that they would just stop torturing her if she confessed to the things that they were accusing her of. So all that to say that we don't actually know to what extent women were accused of witchcraft based on the fact that they were also midwives and healers and herbologists. And we do know, though, that for a lot of women, that was the case. And we do know that being an independent, older, self-sufficient, wise woman was seen as a threat and was certainly exploited. I'm not saying that every single person who accused a woman of being a witch was doing it because she had these qualities or because she was a healer of some kind. But I'm just saying that we know that these qualities were perceived as a threat and certainly didn't help anyone's case. And we also know that a woman wouldn't have been accused of cursing a baby that died during a birth if she hadn't been there as the midwife, for example. So sometimes, I think it's pretty clear. But we also know that not all the women who were accused were healers and medicine women and what have you as well. What we also know is that natural medicine and herbology and midwifery and witchcraft have been around since long before conventional medicine and long before the witch trials, way back when. We have always been using food and herbs, plants as medicine. And even though today, even there are many people who are skeptical about natural medicine and naturopathy and nutrotherapy, we've been doing this since the beginning of time, people. So one example would be that we have used willow, the bark of willow, for ages for treating pain. And evidence of the early use of willow first surfaced in 1862. I have notes, hang on. Edwin Smith, an American trader living in Cairo, purchased a pair of ancient documents. These scrolls dated back to around 1500 BC and are amongst the most important historical documents in medicine. One of these documents is an Egyptian record of around 160 herbal and vegetable remedies. The use of willow bark for pain relief continued through ancient Greece, where it was recommended, by Hippocrates, and so on and so forth. It's been used ever since, and it's still used today. It's used today for a lot of the same reasons you would take aspirin. So for headaches and cramps and arthritis, inflammation, and you can get it at the health food store, the actual bark, and you can just make a tea with it or a tincture, or you can take an aspirin. But why? I'm just a fan of going straight to the source. And I'm just going to leave that there and tell you about another one, because another one is one that has gotten a lot of people into trouble, including some so-called witches, and that is foxglove, which is very dangerous, very poisonous. Please do not go and eat any. Just don't do anything with it. Just look at it. It's so beautiful. It's one of my favorite flowers. But if you don't use it properly, it's extremely dangerous. But it has a long history of medicinal use for heart and kidney problems. And legend says that Van Gogh used it to treat his epilepsy. And there's, forgive me for not remembering this, I just remember seeing somewhere that there's a painting. I believe he might even have foxgloves in the painting. And it's from around the time that he was using foxglove. There's a story. I'm going to look for it and I'll post it in the show notes, so you can go check it out if you want to. Anyways, there's an old saying about foxgloves, and it goes, it can raise the dead and it can kill the living. So if that's not convincing enough, don't eat it, don't touch it. But hear me say this. In the 1700s, William Withering learned of this folk remedy from an old woman and studied it. And this led to digitalis being a very important plant-derived medicine for heart disease that is still used today. And that's just two examples. There are tons of them. So before I leave you, I'm going to give you two little nuggets to take away with you. And one is an herb that you probably have in your house right now. And if you don't, you can get it at any grocery store. It has a bunch of medicinal properties. And I'm going to tell you how to use it. And then I'm going to give you a little spell that you can do yourself at home if you want to, as just a little tiny, just a little ritual that you can do in the spirit of today's theme. So the herb is sage. Dun, 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 dun. Sage is used in cooking tons. It's used in cleansing rituals. It is used for like smudging, for example, clearing out bad energy. It's used for all kinds of ceremonial practices, spiritual practices. In herbology, it's used for a ton of therapeutic properties. And it is from the Mediterranean. So it's in the same family as, like, I think oregano and possibly mint. But it is in every like typical Mediterranean spice blend. Basically, it's used a lot in savory cooking. I use it a ton in autumn cooking, like in stews and roasted potatoes, roasted veggies, things like that. And sage, okay, so the ancient Romans and Greeks used sage for their digestive issues. The Egyptians used it to support fertility. Brazilians used it as a mouth refresher. By chewing on some leaves. I'm just going to tell you right away, before you just go shove a handful of leaves in your mouth, you should bite a tiny bit or rub a fresh leaf in your hand and just smell it and see if it agrees with you. It's a very strong and almost pungent, it's just a very specific flavor that I can't even describe. So it can be a bit whelming if you're not used to it. All right. Some people have used it for menstrual complaints, menopausal symptoms. They've used it as an antiseptic. They've used it for fever, for common colds, ulcers, and even liver cleansing. I personally use it as a tea. So I use the dried leaves as a tea to help me sleep. I have a bit of trouble sleeping, and I find that a sage tea is super helpful. So I'm going to tell you how to make a sage tea. Like I said, it's a very strong flavor. It's not everybody's favorite. So if you find it's a bit strong, but you still want to try it out, you can mix other herbs in it that you like a mint or lavender or some citrus. And if you want even a bit of sweetener, I like it without, but all right, so here it is. To make a pot of sage tea, you take 4 cups of water, boiled, a half an ounce of fresh sage leaves, so roughly like 40-ish leaves. You put like a teaspoon or 1.5 teaspoons of lemon zest, or a squeeze of lemon juice, or a few squeezes of lemon juice. Like I said before, you can add some sweetener if you want. You can throw in some mint leaves. You can throw in, what did I say? They like licorice if you want. There's all kinds of things you can mix with it. Experiment a little bit. If you have a favorite herbal tea, you can just add a handful of sage leaves, dried or fresh, to your tea. And there you go. All right, so that's your tea. As promised, I have a little witchy ritual for you to do if you want. And I created this specially for you because I like to pull oracle cards, and I keep getting the same card over and over again lately. And it's a card about creating sacred space for yourself. So I chose for you a creating sacred space ritual that you can do. Ready? What you're going to need is a candle in a candle holder, incense in a censer or an incense holder, matches or lighter, a small cup of water, a small dish of salt, sand, or earth. Okay, ready? What you're going to do is you're going to light the candle. I don't know why I just asked you if you're ready. So you just had all those things on hand and you were going to do it now. But I'm moving on to the instructions, is what I meant to say. Light the candle and the incense. Take a minute to be fully mindful of the moment. Carry the incense around the space in which you wish to work, saying, I bless this space with air. Carry the candle around the space, saying, I bless this space with fire. Carry the cup of water around the space, saying, I bless this space with water. Then carry the salt around the space, saying, I bless this space with earth. Return to your starting place and close your eyes. Reach out with your heart and connect to your spiritual hearth. And say, I call upon the power of the spiritual hearth to bless this space. And that's it. There's your witchy ritual to do. I wish you all a very, very happy Halloween, and I will talk to you soon. In the meantime, take really good care of yourselves. Bye.